All right, welcome back after a long weekend. I'm going to go ahead and get started on the Gulf Stream lecture. So today is another lecture day, along with some short in-class assignments, which I have started assigning before class. So if you go to your assigned tab, you're going to see those in-class assignments, but of course I will prompt you to complete them when we get to the point in lecture where I've given you enough background material that I think you can do well on them. I put in the text here that there is assigned reading, just chapter 1 of that book that I assigned on the Gulf of Mexico, and a short 1 to 2 question homework assigned that's due Friday before class. So this is not meant to take a lot of time. It's mostly reading comprehension, just kind of a checkbox that you can say that you did the work and that you get points for it. And I've been sending out reminders of due dates. There are a lot of assignments for this class, and so you'll see the due dates on Top Hat, and I'll try and call them out when they're coming up. But if you need some more reminders, I urge you to follow the class Twitter. So today we're going to cover Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico circulation, eddy formation and the importance of eddies, the importance of the Gulf Stream in terms of ocean heat transfer, the role of the loop current in Gulf Stream variability, how currents are measured, and a little bit extra about deep water currents in the Gulf. The learning goals for today are to understand that circulation in the Gulf of Mexico is largely driven by the loop current. We'll learn what that is. That the Gulf Stream transports heat and influences the climate of adjacent land masses. That we can measure currents using satellite altimetry, and that there's still very little known, or relatively little known, about the drivers of variability in the loop current and the Gulf Stream in general. Okay, so to understand circulation in the Gulf of Mexico, we need to understand circulation in the North Atlantic Ocean, because circulation in the Gulf of Mexico is linked to the larger circulation pattern in the North Atlantic Ocean, and this is the North Atlantic gyre. So gyres are circulation patterns that are circular in motion, that cover a large portion of an ocean. In this case, we're covering the North Atlantic. And then the North Atlantic gyre is bounded on the west by the Gulf Stream. So you can see here the Gulf Stream moving up the east coast of the US. The north equatorial current is what bounds the gyre on the south end. And this current makes a detour in the Gulf right here before it becomes the Gulf Stream. So all of that equatorial water eventually finds its way into the Gulf. And then note a portion of the Gulf Stream also continues northeast as the North Atlantic current up here. So all of the water from the Gulf is involved in a circulation pattern that eventually makes its way up into much colder climates, such as Scandinavia and Britain. So as the equatorial water enters the Gulf, what ends up forming is something called the loop current. And this is a current that is kind of arch-shaped like that, where water enters through the Yucatan Channel, kind of meanders a little bit in the Gulf, and then heads back out through the Florida Straits in what's known as the Florida Current. There are also a couple of other features that form in the Gulf of Mexico besides the loop current, though the loop current is the dominant circulation pattern in the Gulf. You also have boundary currents that are driven by the wind, and these tend to move water in a clockwise direction. So you get this current that moves water along the boundary of the Gulf of Mexico roughly clockwise. And if something is moving clockwise in oceanography, we call it anticyclonic. So that might be a term you remember from Intro to Oceanography. And if not, we'll review it here. And then we have some along shelf currents, like this one right here, that move water counterclockwise or cyclonic. And then in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, we tend to have these things called eddies form, and we'll talk more about what an eddy is in the next few slides. But you can see here that's a circular kind of cell of water movement that's much smaller than a gyre, just like a little patch of circular moving water. So to understand eddies, first we need to understand how they form. And the eddies that form in the Gulf of Mexico are largely due to changes in how the loop current moves. So periodically, the loop current, which usually looks like this, will kind of extend more into the Gulf of Mexico. It bulges inward into the Gulf of Mexico. And as it does so more and more, it becomes unstable, and eventually it can pinch off and form an eddy that moves roughly like this. So essentially, this tip of the loop current will break off and form a circular movement of water. And so here I have the definition of an eddy. A loop current eddy is a circular movement of water causing a small, what we would think of as like a whirlpool. And we're talking about relatively small, right? Like you're not going to be in a boat and like point out a little whirlpool happening in the water and be like, that's an eddy. If you were in a boat, you might notice that you were in an eddy because the water current would change direction, but it's much, much larger than a person would be able to see. You could see it from satellites. Smaller in terms of it's not the size of a gyre. The loop current usually produces a new eddy about every 6 to 11 months. And those eddies can stick around for a while, so they'll drift around the Gulf of Mexico. They'll gradually lose steam and lose their motion over time, but they do drift around the Gulf of Mexico. So you can see in this last step, after we have a new eddy, after we had an eddy form, that old eddy can be drifting around the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, the loop current is getting ready to form a new one. Depending on how these eddies break off, they can have different characteristics. So the one that we saw in the previous slide, the pinched off section of the loop current itself, can form warm core eddies. So this is warm water from the equator that's moving in the loop current. If you get water pinched off from the loop current, it's going to be warm water. These are the types of eddies that move clockwise. And if you end up having an eddy that forms because a bit of cold water gets pinched off, so you see here the loop current is kind of moving as such that it might pinch off a little bit of cold water, then you would get a cold core eddy. And so these would move counterclockwise. So the loop current can form a whole bunch of these warm core and cold core eddies that will then drift around the Gulf of Mexico. And you generally have multiple of both types of eddies in the Gulf of Mexico at any time. And the surface water in these eddies is noticeably warmer in warm core eddies and noticeably cooler in cold core eddies as it moves around the Gulf. Eddies don't only form in the loop current, so this is not something that's specific to the loop current. Eddies will form anywhere there is moving water. So for instance, they form along the Gulf Stream. Here you have an image of the Gulf Stream moving up the east coast of the US and then heading out into the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see that the Gulf Stream meanders. And as it meanders, there's a possibility of those little loops that form to produce an eddy. So we get eddies forming in the Atlantic Ocean as well. Eddies are really important. They transport and mix fluids. So they're sending fluids essentially from the Gulf Stream in this case out across the Atlantic Ocean to different locations. They mix nutrients, marine organisms. So you can disperse marine animals using these eddies. So it's essentially a way of delivery of all of these materials. And they can act as islands in the ocean, especially warm core eddies. So if you get a patch of warm water in the middle of the ocean, these tend to congregate a bunch of biology, a bunch of living organisms. So in these warm core eddies, you can find intense biological production, a lot of plankton blooms, for instance, and lots of top predators that are trying to take advantage of that warmer water to eat a lot of food. So these are extra special features in the ocean. The Florida Current is what links the Loop Current to the Gulf Stream. The Florida Current is the current that moves through the Florida Straits, right here across the tip of Florida. It carries warm tropical waters that eventually feed the Gulf Stream. The Florida Current is extra special because it's so fast. So it's one of the fastest oceanic currents in the world. And when I'm talking to you about a fast current in the ocean, this current in particular reaches speeds that might exceed 2 meters per second. So that's somewhere around 6 feet per second. So that's fast when it comes to an ocean current. This current, you can see from this image, actually comes very close to shore in some locations. So it's very, very close to shore in southeastern Florida. Off the coast of Miami and Fort Lauderdale, it usually comes within 10 miles of the shore. So to give you an idea of how close is close. So you don't want to be drifting along and not have any idea what the currents are doing if you're boating off of Miami and Fort Lauderdale, because you might end up in a very swift current. So once all of that Gulf of Mexico water makes its way through the Straits of Florida in the Florida Current, it becomes the Gulf Stream. Typically, the end of the Gulf Stream is around Cape Hatteras, right here. So, the end of the Florida Current. So we consider this the Florida Current up until around the Carolinas area, and then we consider this this current to be the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a western boundary current. That is, it bounds a gyre on the western side. Western boundary currents tend to have very similar characteristics in that they're warm, deep, narrow, and swift. So this is warm water coming from the equator. It's quite swift. We talked about how quick the Florida current is. Well, the Gulf Stream is also a relatively fast current. It's pretty well defined. It's not very diffuse, so you get a narrow and deep stream of water. To give you an idea of how wide and how deep it is, I'm not really expecting you to know this, but you might want to know how deep is deep and how narrow is narrow. So it's about 100 kilometers wide and around 800 to 1,200 meters deep, typically. So that's a little bit of oceanography for you. I want to talk a little bit about how, or help you think a little bit about how the Gulf Stream impacts people. So I have an assignment in Top Hat under week 2, session 4 in class that's called Unlikely Neighbors. It's talking about how literature can be defined by a shared history of two nations or groups of nations that exist that share an oceanographic feature. So go ahead, I'm going to give you a few minutes. I'll give you about 10 minutes to complete this assignment, Unlikely Neighbors on Top Hat. Let me know if you have any questions as you complete this. Thanks. Appreciate it. Okay. Anyone need a little bit more time? So what I was trying to get across in this assignment was that these two areas, the Caribbean and Ireland, are really connected by the Gulf Stream. And that forms a major shipping route. And so you would expect shipping to proceed relatively easily between Caribbean and Ireland because of this Gulf Stream. And during colonial times, Britain definitely took advantage of this. And so there were colonies of Britain in the Caribbean as well as closer to home in Ireland. And perhaps some of the native inhabitants of these areas would have felt the same kinds of impacts of British colonialism, such as slavery. And so you see those themes echoing in literature. So you can see how something like an oceanographic feature can really determine which areas of the world are more accessible, and as such, which areas of the world share a common history in some cases. I thought it was pretty cool when I learned about it, and if it's not your cup of tea, it's just participation credit. So, all right. But for real credit, now we're going to do a quiz. So you're all in Top Hat right now because you've done the assignment. So just go ahead and put away your notes. Make sure you're on Top Hat, and I'll be asking you just one quiz question today. This quiz is to match the following descriptions to North Atlantic gyre features. This is another matching question. Those features are the loop current, North Atlantic current, Gulf Stream, and Florida current. Make sure you hit submit on your answers. Okay, I'm going to close this soon. All right. So the correct answers were a strong oceanic current flowing northward along the eastern coast of Florida is the Florida Current. A western boundary current that begins offshore of Cape Hatteras and flows past eastern Canada would be the Gulf Stream. A current in the Gulf of Mexico that bulges northward and forms eddies would be the Loop Current. And a continuation of the flow of warm water northeast towards Europe would be the North Atlantic Current. Nice job. All right, I want to talk briefly about heat transfer. We will certainly talk more about climate change, but just the basics here about the Gulf Stream's role in heat transfer. So the Florida Current and the Gulf Stream end up bringing heat to the east coast of North America. So you can see that heat from the equator is translated to the east coast of North America that keeps water here relatively warm when you compare it to, for instance, conditions on the west coast. It's much more comfortable to swim off the coast of the Carolinas than it is, for instance, off the coast of some middle regions of California. In turn, the North Atlantic Current, so this extension that extends up towards Europe, brings heat to the west coast of Europe. And this is largely responsible for the relatively mild climate of, for instance, Britain, and the relatively warm climate of Scandinavia as compared to other regions, for instance, Greenland, even though they share the same latitudes. You get kind of a transfer of heat that forms kind of a belt or a constant circular motion. So as that pole water, all that warm water at the poles cools, it sinks because it becomes more dense, and then it forms a layer of bottom water. So this colder bottom water is traveling along the bottom towards the equator. And at the equator, that water will rise, and as it warms, it will become part of the surface currents and transform into Gulf Stream water once again. So it's a kind of process or cycle. We like to call it this circulation belt in the world's oceans that transfers heat, delivers warm water to the poles, and takes cold water away from the poles and distributes and mixes it elsewhere so it can warm and rise again. This is advanced material here, but I wanted you to understand a lot about, there's a lot of things about the Gulf Stream that we don't understand. So for instance, there's a lot of interest in fully understanding and being able to model what the Gulf Stream does. We want to know what drives changes and patterns in the Gulf Stream so we can figure out where it's going to go at any given time. This can really help us understand things like movement of materials like oil during oil spills. We really want to know where that oil goes or where it's going to go. And the Gulf Stream can deliver a lot of materials like I mentioned before. So we would want to know what the Gulf Stream is doing to predict that. We want to know what the Gulf Stream is doing because it might help us understand if hurricanes will strengthen, might help us develop seasonal forecasts, or even help us understand climate predictions. But the Gulf Stream is really difficult to model because it's actually chaotic in nature, and chaos means behavior so unpredictable as to appear random. And to have chaos, you have to have great sensitivity to small changes in conditions. This is like the butterfly effect, right? So a flap of the butterfly's wings can change weather patterns in the future. And that makes something like the Gulf Stream very, very, very difficult to predict because inherent in this Gulf Stream's movement is chaos. It's also really cool. Some of that variability that we see in the Gulf Stream is actually determined by what happens in the Gulf of Mexico. So the loop current sets the pace. Whatever happens in the loop current can really help us determine what's happening in the Gulf Stream. When the loop current is expanded into the Gulf of Mexico, and we're seeing that bulging into the Gulf of Mexico, what you actually see is there's a weakened Florida current, and ultimately the Gulf Stream is weakened. When we see a contraction of the loop current, for instance, after an eddy breaks off, then we see a strengthening of the Florida current and the Gulf Stream. So these are some basics that we can try and understand, the connection between the loop current and what happens in the Gulf Stream, and we can maybe develop better predictive models. But there's still a lot to learn about the loop current itself. And so we actually have some of the preeminent scientists studying the loop current at OSU. In the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences, we have Dr. Haosheng Huang, who is at the forefront of important loop current research. And there's actually been a lot of money in the past few years to develop better predictive models for the loop current and to understand why, when it forms eddies, when it's at different locations in the Gulf Stream, in the Gulf of Mexico, those kinds of things, and its impacts on the Gulf Stream. The last few slides I have will be about measuring currents. So first we'll talk about measuring surface currents, because this is relatively easy to do. We kind of have this down. It's hard to measure actual movement of water on a large scale, because what are you going to do? You're going to put a bunch of floats out there and track their progress? That seems like a huge effort. But we've actually developed really good ways to track surface currents using satellites. So surface current movement can be measured indirectly through remote sensing with satellites, which allow complete aerial coverage of the globe. And that's because surface currents are geostrophic currents, which means they follow lines of constant pressure. They're largely geostrophic currents. And pressure, and therefore geostrophic currents, can be calculated if we know sea surface height. Sea surface height is something we can get from satellites. As we ping an area on the Earth, we can calculate how much time it takes that ping to go back to the satellite, and we can calculate sea surface height. In the ocean, temperature is also a function of sea surface height, because thermal expansion of warmer water will cause that water to have higher surface height. So we can understand temperature from satellites as well. And if we get things like sea surface height and the temperature of the water, and then also plug in some knowledge about the prevailing winds, and we put all of that into a model, we actually have really, really, really good models that are able to estimate surface currents, which direction they're moving in, how fast they're moving. And so from that information, with a little bit of additional modeling expertise, we're able to really track what surface currents are doing at any given time. I have a lot of words on this slide, so I'll give you a little extra time. Okay. This is also some advanced material, but I want all of you to know that we do know a bit about deep currents as well. It's much more difficult to measure the currents below the surface because these are not accessible via satellite information. So we do actually have to use devices that we allow to drift around with these currents to understand them. And one technique is to use a device called a float, which is pictured in this top right corner image. So these are deployed from a ship, and they'll sink down to a preset depth in the ocean, and then they'll be allowed to drift with the currents at that depth. And then they have, throughout the Gulf of Mexico, a series of acoustic buoys that are able to ping and track the float's location over time and give real-time data for that. And then after a set amount of time, the float will drop its weight and rise to the surface and transmit its data to a satellite. So you'll get all sorts of data depending on what sensors you have on the float, for instance, temperature, pressure. And from all of this, you get trajectories of the floats that look like tangled spaghetti. If we put them all on a diagram, we get something that we call a spaghetti diagram, which is just a whole bunch of paths of different floats. And then we have to develop or decipher general patterns from this information. And for the most part, we are able to decipher some general patterns. So for instance, we know that there is a deep boundary current that flows counterclockwise along the perimeter of the western Gulf of Mexico. So here it's moving counterclockwise. That's pretty consistent. And we also know a couple of locations where deep eddies tend to form. So one of them is off of the Campeche Bank. And these eddies are moving in a clockwise direction, so they're moving like this. And then we also have eddies forming off of the West Florida shelf, so like right here, and these eddies tend to move in a counterclockwise direction. So these are some consistent features of the deep Gulf of Mexico circulation that we know of from using these floats. All right, in the last 10 minutes, I have one more assignment for you. This one's called Diving in a Loop Current. This is about the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and their efforts to do some deep sea research in the Gulf of Mexico, and how they always have to pay attention to the current conditions in the Gulf of Mexico because there are areas where even deep currents will move quite quickly, and it makes it very dangerous to dive. So on any given day, because the loop current moves so much, they need to pay close attention to conditions to be able to determine if they can dive safely. So I'm going to have you work through this assignment, and I'll call you all back in about 8 minutes, just a minute before class ends, and we'll debrief. One of the questions mentions a black star marking the dive location, and you don't see a star on any of the photos. So I do think that there's a black star there. It might be overly small. It's outlined in white. If you can't see that star, then let me see what questions I think you can answer. Can anyone see the star? Okay, some people can. If you can't see the star, just type in the text box that you can't see the star. That way you're getting participation credit for the exercise. But I can tell you right now, if you do want to answer the question, the star in the first image, when they had trouble diving, it's like directly in the loop current. I'll just type this out for you guys. The star on December 1st is directly in the loop current. It should give you enough context to answer the questions. And then the star on April 30th. The star on April 30th is in an area with very short arrows outside the loop current. No, I'm not going to assign this as homework because you have homework to do already tonight, so I don't want you to give you two assignments. I am ending this assignment at 12:30. You will have a little extra time after class to finish it up. And if you don't think that you can finish, I just want you to type in the text boxes to make sure that you get your credit for the participation. Yes, the stars are in the images that are actually part of the question. So the images say like Coast Watch, NOAA, AOML at the top that I've pulled directly from the NOAA website and put a star on them. Yeah, sure. The question is, will I post answers? What I can do is at the beginning of next class, I can go over this one, and I'll point out where the stars were, so that way you're able to read these maps better and understand what I was trying to get at. It's no problem. And I do think I am sharing my screen, so if you do want to pop back over to the classroom, I can show you where the star is on the second one. And then on the first one. Okay, so the goal of this exercise were to understand that on the first day, when they were trying to dive, but the conditions did not allow them to, they were actually trying to dive in the Gulf, in the loop current. And you can see the strongest currents on these images are the ones with the longest arrows. I think it's pretty clear that the boundaries of the loop current are really, really strong currents that you would not want to dive in because they would sweep you away. On the second day, when they had more luck, they were able to dive in an area that was adjacent to the loop current, which was currently forming an eddy. And so that left them a lot of room on the West Florida shelf to dive in some relatively low current strengths. And these are denoted by the very, very small arrows. So they were diving in a green looking area with some very small arrows, likely much better conditions for diving. Today's conditions, I took a peek at them and I think that they were actually pretty good at 25 north, 85 west. But this is, as I mentioned, all for participation credits for trying out, and we can go over where I can share those exact slides and show you what I mean by long arrows and short arrows at the beginning of class next time. Just to wrap up, for next time, we are going to give you an idea of where we're heading. We're going to talk about prehistoric culture in the Gulf of Mexico, about mound building cultures and mound building itself, about tribes in the northern Gulf of Mexico and early coastal cultures around the world. So it'll be a little bit of a shift in thinking. We'll be doing a lot more like ancient coastal culture history. I will see you on Friday.